We're going to get started here. I know we got a couple stragglers, but we promised the people on the internet we were going to start streaming at 6:30. So I want to thank you all for coming. It means a lot to us to be here with you in person. We don't always get the opportunity to do that. Tonight we were planning to celebrate our 7-year anniversary and all of the progress that you guys have helped accomplish for water quality here in Florida. Unfortunately, as you know, there's a pretty bad red tide situation happening right now along the coast, so that we wanted to use that time to get together with you guys and really talk about what's happening, answer some of the questions that you guys have, and after that, we're going to show a film that we haven't premiered in public yet. We're actually planning to show it last year, right before Hurricane Ian hit. It documents one of the most significant achievements in the history of our organization, Senate Bill 2508. So we hope after this presentation, you guys will stick around to watch that. It is pretty exciting, and it also shows, how this organization is effective, not because of the people that are employed by this organization, but because of all of you in this room and thousands across the country that are speaking up for our waters here. So thank you guys for coming tonight. We're just going to dive right into it. I know we're going live right now, and we're going to get down to business. So Captain Daniel Andrews, our co-founder and executive director, is going to talk to you guys about water quality and the red tide situation happening right now, along with special guests. We have Dr. Eric Milbrandt from the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. He is the Marine Lab Director over there, and he knows a lot more about the science than this salty fisherman. So we're going to have a little bit of both. So you guys, if you want to come on up, we have 2 mics up here. Sure. So we're going to dive into this presentation and then have a little Q&A afterwards. If you guys have any questions you want to ask these guys and get them answered, you're welcome to fire away.
Thanks for coming out tonight, Eric. I know Captain Cody Pierce is the new Calusa waterkeeper who's with us here tonight. Above all else, at Captains for Clean Water, the partnership with other like-minded organizations is at the top of our list. We know that to be successful, it takes everybody rowing in the same direction. So we're fortunate that y'all are both here tonight. Eric is a marine biologist who has recently co-authored a really interesting study that came out last year on red tide, so he can talk a little bit more about that. But and can also give us a little kind of status update of where we are right now with this bloom and what we can or can't expect going forward. But the thing that excites me most is just how many people keep coming out and wanting to get involved with this issue. When it comes to red tide, there's a lot of stuff that's out of our control, and there's some stuff that's within our control. And as you'll see tonight, please stick around for the documentary on Senate Bill 2508. I know a documentary on a piece of legislation is probably not the most exciting thing when you think of it, but I promise you it's not boring. It's about a half hour long, and it overviews a landmark piece of absolutely horrible legislation that sailed through the Florida legislature. Many people in this room went up to fight it, and it's something that if that were to have passed and been signed into law, it would have equated to more Lake Okeechobee discharges and ultimately would have exacerbated these red tide issues that we're dealing with right now. And the red tide bloom that we have right now is bad, but it could be made a lot worse. And that's something that is our focus at Captains for Clean Water, not treating the symptoms of these problems, but working on the holistic solutions to try to give us more years of good water and less years of bad water, to lessen the intensity and the frequency of these blooms that have really devastated our economy and our quality of life. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Milbrandt to make some remarks on this, and we'd like to open this up to questions as soon as we can, because I know you all came here with questions and we're here to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate the introduction. So this year, obviously we had this massive storm come through. And if you look back in history, the last 20 years, summer after Hurricane Charlie, summer after Hurricane Irma, those are 2 of the 3 years where we've had like extended blooms where they last a long time. This particular red tide It tends to come in November. It used to be much smaller and patchier, so you wouldn't notice it every year, but it does almost occur every year between November and March. And this time of year is kind of when it starts to fizzle out. But in those 3 periods that I was telling you about, one was the 2 were the hurricane related, and 1 was related to Piney Point, which was a water spill from a mined area in Tampa Bay that occurred. So, you know, I'm optimistic. I'm looking at the data from this week, and the counts are down, but we had a pretty bad week on Sanibel. A lot of Goliath grouper, tarpon, all species really. It's not discriminatory in terms of the way that it affects fish. And just to speak to Daniel's point about, you know, it could be a lot worse. 2018 was a lot worse because what happened was there was a very large hypoxic zone or no oxygen zone on the bottom, and we saw the effects of that. I mean, the ocean was the wrong color, it smelled, and there was a lot of fish that were, and turtles and even a whale shark. So, you know, I'm optimistic that we're going to get through this. We've been doing some research, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that, just to give you a flavor of what we're doing. Like the last 2 days, I would have shown you some more graphics about what the state numbers are for red tide along the West Coast. It's pretty much from, you know, Tampa to the Florida Keys. But the last 2 days, I've been out on the water on Monday and today in a truck, and I was with some specialists that can recognize different sources of water, whether they're from certain crop types, certain land uses, wastewater, golf courses, and fertilizer. So we were from, you know, 5 miles offshore all the way up this morning. We were all around Moorhaven and Ortona and Fort Deneau and all those areas, sampling the tributaries. So we're trying to piece together this mechanism. We've demonstrated through science that the nitrogen concentrations and the loads that are happening both at S79, Franklin Lock, and coming out of Lake Okeechobee intensify the blooms. And we know that our activity on the west coast of Florida does create conditions that intensify the bloom and expand the length and the geographic area. So, you know, it's getting to that mechanism. It's not a simple thing. There's replicates and a lot of samples and a lot of analysis and modeling and engineering that goes into it. So I wish I could give you a quick, fast answer, but you know, we've been studying this thing since the mid-40s, and we, you know, it's still very unpredictable and very large when the blooms occur. So yeah, with that, I'm happy to help answer any questions that you might have, and you know, we can walk around with a mic, or people can just stand up and we'll repeat the questions.
Yeah, and make sure you repeat it anyway, because there's a bunch of people that are watching online and they might not hear it too. So. And Lane.
So my understanding is the lake levels are pretty high right now. I know that the dike has been reinforced and has the ability to hold that water currently. Do you have any indication on what release action is going to take place, or how that's going to kind of shake out?
Loaded question.
So, yeah, I think, you know, the lake levels are high. They're discharging as much as they can to the south. No one wants to discharge an algae bloom to the Caloosahatchee like what happened in 2018 when they panicked and the first day of hurricane season and said, oh my gosh, the lake's high, the dike's compromised, and we have to get rid of all this water. So let's push it out the east and west coast. There's a lot of people that are on our coast that are saying, well, we have this red tide, guys. You might want to try and find every possible place you can release the water. And we do receive an amount of water that's helpful for maintaining the salinity gradient in the estuary. And from my observations the last few months, those discharges are not having a negative effect in the estuary, which is where you would think they would happen, up at, near Fort Myers and near Shell Point and so on. But they are contributing to an overall load. I mean, when you assume that all those nutrients and stuff gets recycled many times before it gets to the Gulf of Mexico, but we're still sort of, we're taking that water for the benefits, and we're still having this bloom that's not just the Caloosahatchee. The algae bloom is from Tampa to the Keys, so it's not specifically related to those discharges. But I would say I'll throw it over to Daniel because he's probably more involved with the decision makers than I am.
So the lake is very high right now. It's almost 15.5 feet, which is a couple feet higher than it should be this time of year. It's purely a function of weather at this point. If we get a lot of rain, if we have an early start to rainy season, unfortunately, it's probably not going to be a great summer for water quality. Some of the projections right now are showing that we're very likely to go into an El Nino weather pattern, which would mean that our rainy season wouldn't quite be as rainy, and it's kind of happening at a really good time if that were to happen, because an El Nino typically means a pretty rainy spring. But if that transition goes into effect in the summertime, it would be kind of a less rainy summer, and because it just kind of spreads the water out throughout the year. So that being said, I used to spend about 320 days a year on the water, and the weatherman is never right. So it's very hard to make those projections at this point, but it's until the Everglades are restored, until we have capacity to send significantly more water south from Lake Okeechobee, store it, clean it, send it south through the EAA into the Everglades. That way the Everglades is getting that clean water, and we can do that on a calendar year. We're going to continue to be in this conundrum that we're in right now, to where when the lake's high and there's a red tide bloom, there aren't really that many options. And that's what, low sun gets us a little bit closer to it. That EAA reservoir, the Central Everglades plan, and Everglades restoration as a whole, you have to look at moving water south on a calendar year, not on oh shoot, the lake's really high, how can we lower it? Because Florida's very flat. And unfortunately, the water in Lake Okeechobee has been suffering from pollution for a century. So it takes wetlands. And what happened during Hurricane Ian is that 60,000 acres of wetlands that we had to clean that water were used pretty much exclusively to deal with the massive amount of rain that fell on the EAA, the sugar fields out there. So those wetlands were cleaning up that mess. So now they're kind of like over capacity. And if you put too much water into them, it damages that filtration. So it's, again, this is why Everglades restoration matters. The more capacity you have to store water, clean it, and send it south, the better off we'll be in these scenarios going forward. But yeah, as far as if there's discharges, if we start to get a lot of rain real early before mid-June, that chance goes up significantly. The lake drops like a rock. Late May, early June, when it's hot and windy, the lake drops really quickly. So if a early start to rainy season stops that. So it's I think it's anybody's guess at this point. Yes.
Do they have red tide on the East Coast?
Question was, do they have red tide on the East Coast?
It's rare because of the depth of the ocean there, and it only occurs when it goes around the peninsula. So it starts here in the Gulf, and it can spread. Like right now, it's low concentrations, but it's near Key West, and it can wrap around the state through ocean currents and be detected there. But it's never the kinds of concentrations that we get here, because it's just a lot more volume and a lot deeper ocean. So, if you think about these things need light, and the light is only within the first 2 or 3 meters or 6 to 8 feet of water. So if they get downwelled or if they sink, then they can no longer swim up against the currents. Then then they're lost. Essentially, they can't grow anymore. But the west coast of Florida, we have a very broad continental shelf, and it's quite shallow. So they stay in that photic zone, even though they're being pushed around by the ocean currents.
In 2018, there were a pretty decent number of dead fish that washed up Miami, I think all the way up to Vero Beach from it. But again, the impacts over there are minimal compared to what we see in the Gulf Coast. But enough to where it made the front page of the Miami Herald when it was happening.
The St. Lucy's dropping water out into the ocean on that side, right? So they're doing a little bit of what we do on this side.
But it would have a lot less of an impact because they don't have that, that water hits the ocean currents and quickly moves away. Here in the Gulf, any pollution that does enter the waterways, it stays more local for longer than it would over there. Now, the discharges have a horrible effect on the estuary there, but once it makes its way to the ocean where the red tide would be, it dissipates pretty quickly.
Eric, there are other ecosystems in the globe that are very similar to ours, the South Shore of Cuba. Are other countries working as diligently on red tide, and are we working together with them?
So the question was about international efforts on harmful algal blooms. I know that wasn't exactly the way you asked it, but
Sure.
So in China, they have algae blooms because large agricultural areas and populated areas are drained, and they have harmful algal blooms. And harmful algal blooms, unfortunately, it's an international problem as ocean temperatures get warmer, and the fact that we've turned nitrogen gas into fertilizer and are putting it into the oceans constantly, it's become a problem. So I would say the United States is a leader, but our efforts are still lag way behind in terms of research. There's been an initiative to come up with engineering solutions. Most of those engineering solutions to treat a bloom are kind of in the beaker kind of phase, whereas the biologists that study these things have been underfunded, I would say, for a long time. I know that those efforts within the United States, there's a program for harmful algal bloom research through NOAA, and those projects are spread throughout the United States. That community is pretty tightly knit, I would say. But the international community is probably not as engaged as the United States is.
My question is, the lake is an extreme catalyst to our problem. But as of right now, it's just a catalyst. What, if anything, can we do to, I know Ian was a catastrophe, but what can we do so that the next catastrophe that will come, whether it's 5 years, I mean, we had 2 major hurricanes in 5 freaking years hit us, and 4 in the last 17. So this is nothing that's going to change. What, if anything, can we do to our local watershed to try and stem the amount of pollutants that our local area is putting into our waters?
That's a great question. It's not easy.
I know it's not a pleasant question, because the reality is, development needs to change drastically, and all the things that we're doing to bring all these people here is what's killing us.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, the more stormwater treatment that we can provide, the better, because most of our problem is what's called non-point source. So it doesn't come from a single pipe. A lot of the natural areas have been modified and drained and ditched and so on. So, I mean, I always say, septic to sewer conversion would be a game changer. I also, talk about fertilizer. Why do you need, bright green St. Augustine everywhere? And we have ordinances to limit fertilizer, but it's hard to enforce those, and it's a behavioral thing too. So I mean, any chance we get that we can acquire land and put it into conservation, any chance we can get to make a filter marsh, an engineered area, a wetland that you could pump polluted water in or run water through before it gets, let the plants absorb it. Those are all sort of solutions, but it's, yeah,
But I mean, like,
the
is that
population
land,
growth.
is that land even available to do that?
There are probably some willing, yeah, there probably are some pieces.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, to me, this is such, there's so much of this issue that is a local problem to us. And it's, I listen to everybody complain, and Captain's has done so much. And, the reality of their mission is Everglades restoration. And at the same time, we can't continue to put so much on Captain's plate. But somewhere, we've got to make a drastic change within this county on a local level. There's got to be some type of call to action to our local people here, to our representatives, our commissioners, to be like, you people are doing this to us by allowing the non-stop development, no impact fees, no, let's just build, and let's, cost of the wind, and, by the time I'm dead and gone, it really won't be my problem. It'll be your grandkids' problem, or your probably, at this point, it'll be kids' problem, because we're so close to just utter disaster at every turn.
Yeah, well said. A couple comments there, Ozzy. If you look just at our Caloosahatchee Basin, so red tide is nitrogen limited, so it's generally the more nitrogen you're putting in the water, that's what's going to fuel the blooms worse. About 75% of that nitrogen that comes from the Caloosahatchee Basin comes from ag land. And then if you look at Lake Okeechobee discharges, look at the Kissimmee Basin, which feeds Lake O, it's again about 75% there. The state is behind on accountability there, and that's something that needs to be pushed forward. There's some legislation this year that's likely going to be addressing some of that. But again, it's a very big problem, very big area. And if you do look at something like, what could have been done differently in Lee County for a hurricane, Eric can probably chime in more on this, but I mean, when you have an inundation event where there's 10 or 12 feet of water, it's very hard to get the sewer, the septic, anything to be able to withstand, 12 feet of storm surge that's going at the velocity that it inundates the septic systems, the sewer systems. And I mean, I was in homes that got inundated with a surge, and they had bags of fertilizer in their garage that were this high up that exploded. And, then you look at what happened all the way up through Arcadia with the Peace River, it hit a once in 500-year flood event. What it was not only bringing all the nutrients we added to the land, but, massive trees were getting ripped down the Peace River. And I was in Estero Bay a couple days after the storm, and there were parts of the bay that had like mangrove leaves, like 6-8 inches deep in the back of the bay, full trees that came, palm trees from Fort Myers Beach. And it doesn't take that much nitrogen in the water to get red tide to kind of spike a little bit to the point where it can kind of sustain a bloom like this. It is a very hard thing to, let the scientists speak on this too, but it's a very hard thing to say, doing all this would have X% impact. There's so many variables when you have a storm like an Ian or an Irma, which were catastrophic to this area. I look at Everglades restoration, and at the end of the day, each one of us has a certain level of energy, of resource, of whatever we can put into this fight. And it's, even with the amount of momentum we have right now, it is still very much an uphill battle. And it is still very much a David versus Goliath fight, as you'll see in this film. And the amount of energy that you can personally exert, that you can put into this fight, I see that as, from an advocacy, science, and policy perspective, I see that as the biggest way that we're going to, and again, we've got a lot of momentum right now, but until that water's flowing south, until that reservoir is built, there's threats to that constantly. Do that, be a good steward of your own land, encourage your neighbors to be good stewards of their own land. But again, go back to the nitrogen contributions to this basin, and you'll see, the vast majority of the nutrients that are coming in here are coming from ag lands within the area. And a lot of that, is fertilizer that was put on years or decades ago, more so with phosphorus. Nitrogen is a lot flashier than that, but this is not a problem that anybody in the globe is doing an excellent job of solving right now. Nutrient pollution is a global problem. It's something that where our society was at 100 years ago, nobody was concerned about nutrient pollution. We developed these practices that are now archaic because we're seeing the impacts from them. And you take Florida, that was 100 years ago as an agrarian society. Now it's a vibrant tourism-driven economy. We have to make changes there. And yes, they have to be complex. There's a lot of moving pieces to it. I think about this every day, every night. I wake up in the morning thinking about it. And it's like the amount of energy that our team, our supporters exert into Everglades restoration, it's mind blowing. And again, it's still an uphill battle there. So it's, I guess my message there is don't let up on the gas, because everything that we've fought for to this point could be gone like that. I don't, like your opinion on that too. I don't know that we'll ever be in a place that we can do anything to avoid having a bloom like this after a hurricane. Maybe not, but like just watching the amount of debris, the amount of muck that gets sucked out of all these drainage ditches when there is a hurricane, it's pretty mind blowing, just the volume of both inundation and stormwater that comes from it.
Yeah, I mean, just think about from the natural areas, we had all the leaves are stripped off the tree. Where do you think all those amino acids and all those proteins go? They go in the water, and it showed up as a TN spike. So, you're going to have an adapted state of the natural systems. But what we need to do is think more adaptively about hurricanes, I think, and how you do that on a large scale that affects people's behaviors is a hard one to think about. But I think some of our rebuilding efforts need to be conscious of including more natural systems to help protect not only our structures, but to help protect water quality as well.
So essentially, until we get land further south for this water to store, the lake is our reservoir at the moment. So with the filters and the grasses in there, is there concerted effort to stop spraying so much aquatic pesticide, which as those plants decompose, adds more nutrients into the water when they could be filtered?
Yeah, great point. It's something, it's a resource that the state probably hasn't done the best job managing for quite some time. And that problem is compounded by the amount of nutrients that are in the water as well. So you have these invasive exotic plants, of which there's many. Hyacinth and hydrilla are the ones that are talked about most. But the state of Florida uses a primarily chemical herbicide spraying treatment for that. And the edge of Lake Okeechobee, especially on the west side, is full of those invasive exotics. And by killing them, you're essentially expediting the nitrogen cycle, just putting that back in. And excuse me?
And depleting oxygen.
And depleting oxygen. Yeah, it definitely has a negative impact. We helped fund some research through FGCU that they're still analyzing right now. And our question was, what happens to those herbicides when they get down to the saltwater? We're told that they disappear. They're non-harmful. We don't know. And Dr. Parsons from FGCU reached out and wanted us to help fund that study, and we did. It's definitely something we're concerned about. And it was some actions that were taken a decade or longer ago to save money. But ultimately, it's something that is bad for the environment. Chris Whitman, who's the other co-founder at Captains, is actively involved with that issue. He's sat on several different task force and committees with FWC, and It's something we're engaged in, and we're looking for a better solution than what's available now. And we've encouraged the private sector to come forward and come up with some better solutions. Mechanical harvest is actual nutrient export. That's something we support. But again, that's one of many things that's wrong within the overall watershed. And we actually did fund another economic study just on the nutrient export piece of that. How much money are we really saving? We say we're saving money on the chemical spraying, but if we're recycling nutrients and expediting the recycling of nutrients, it's really not saving any money because it's loss of ecological function too. So it's something we're working on, we're diving into, and we see it as part of the solution. Yes.
What is locally or even in the state, what is the impact right now of septic systems? Like how large of an impact is it?
I wish I had the number. So the question is about the impacts of septic systems, either in Lee County or in Florida. I can tell you that there's science in Lee County that shows that septic tanks, especially in the Hancock Creek area, that whole area, are a problem. There's nitrogen, excess dissolved nitrogen that's seeping out of that area. And overall, I think it's very expensive to convert them, but we have a lot of septic tanks in Lee County, too many. They don't really work because you don't have enough absorption in the soil for the nitrogen and phosphorus to really, they're effective in terms of preventing disease. They're totally ineffective in sandy soils for dealing with nitrogen and phosphorus and human waste, really.
In some parts of Florida, like Brevard and Volusia counties, they are a very significant part of the problem. Like probably the primary, they have runoff issues there as well. But it's depending where you go regionally, like especially that Brevard, Volusia County, Banana River area, that's one of their primary problems there. I don't know if you have any estimate of what percent of the nitrogen that would.
I need to look at a table. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. But at least with central sewer, it's all treated and then usually discharged to either a canal or a golf course. It's treated further before it ends up into the estuary. So
is Lee County 100% separated storm and sanitary?
I believe so, because the stormwater, they don't want it in the sanitary sewer.
Right, but I know in history, a lot of cities were built with combination sewer that goes to the city plant. And I didn't know
I'm pretty
where
sure
Fort Myers was on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're separate in Fort Myers.
Bob.
So, first of all, happy anniversary. And my question is going to start with some comments. And that is that 7 years ago, when you started this organization, you herded the cats, people like SCCF, Everglades Foundation, and others. And you've showed us the way. You showed us the way when we had to go up and talk to get Senate Bill 10 passed. You showed us the way when we fought to get the EAA reservoir built. You showed us the way with 2508. And now I'm listening to you and I'm hearing about this horrible storm we had and how it washed out all of these nutrients that have been sitting in these ditches for years. And now they've been washed out. I'm not saying that they're clean. But you talk about big ag, and I'm going to ask you to show us the way again. Who do we need to talk to? Who do we need to make noise to? Who do we need to go stand in front of? Just the way you've showed us before. Just the way we marched to Tally for 2508. What are the next steps? Where do we need to go? You showed us before, show us again. We'll get behind it. Just tell me when and where.
I'll start by saying we didn't show you the way on that stuff. Organizations like SCCF and Everglades Foundation are where we started. By nature, we're fighters. We like to fight, especially when it's for a good cause. And in that regard, yeah, we did rally the troops and point them in the right direction. But everything we did was rooted in science. And the reason that Captains for Clean Water works is because we have a good, solid science foundation that points us. That's our compass. As far as what the next steps are for the fight, I said it before, I'll say it again. Do not take for granted that this reservoir, that the groundbreaking was last Wednesday out there. We've been here before. This reservoir the construction of it has started and then stopped. There's currently lawsuits that the sugar industry has against construction of the STA the operation of the STA and the EAA right now. LOSOM is not in effect yet. That could be challenged. That has to be the primary focus. Keeping that reservoir, getting it built, getting it operational, getting LOSOM actually in effect. We're so close to LOSOM, but so much can go wrong in the last second. SCCF's been there through all of that fight, and it was just a bloodbath from 2019 to now. Senate Bill 2508 we call it the last attack on LOSOM, but there can be another last attack. It was just the most recent one. So we have to get that stuff moving forward. We have to keep it going forward and get it all the way to the finish line. As far as the nutrient pollution side of it, again, it's something that we're paying attention to right now. The opportunities on that, you have the legislature in Tallahassee that has to make those rules on that. When there are opportunities that we see, Jessica Pinsky is our policy director, and she's constantly combing through what's going on in Tallahassee, looking for opportunities. Again, I think there's going to be some legislation this year that is going to move us a step in that direction. That problem is not going to be fixed with any one single bill. It's going to be a lot of steps in the right direction. We believe there's going to be some stuff this year, stormwater, nutrient pollution related stuff that we're going to be there to support. And as always, sign up for our email list. There's QR codes in here somewhere that we can, y'all can sign up for that. Sign up for SCCFs as well, please. And when that opportunity is there, we know that we can count on y'all. That's the reason that progress has gotten to the point where it's at now. We spend every day looking for that next opportunity to advance that. And again, the advancements on nutrient pollution are probably going to be a lot more incremental than the advancements on Everglades restoration, which is why we've dedicated so much of our time to it, because we see, hey, we can get rid of a huge chunk of the nitrogen that gets injected into this estuary very quickly comparatively to what it's going to take to get that same level of benefit out of other nutrient pollution, be it from agriculture or anything else. Fortunately, that a lot of like the septic sewer, all that type of stuff, there's no opposition to that. The opposition that we face on Everglades restoration, the 2020 elections, like $11.1 million injected into campaign contributions just by the sugar industry in the state of Florida. Nobody's opposing septic to sewer conversion. Nobody's opposing a lot of that other stuff. So we have a lot of momentum. There's nobody to really fight on it. It's just a matter of keeping the heat on it. Governor DeSantis just made another huge pledge to water quality that included a lot of benefits to the nutrient pollution, as well as septic sewer is part of that. But we see that momentum building and continuing. And again, the only fight we really have on that is the overall purse in Tallahassee, the overall budget. We're fighting for a chunk of that change, but that's something that's pretty easy for us. But again, it's just going to be long-term incremental on that. Yes, question back here.
So kind of a little more similar question again, back to the red tide situation. You mentioned that you've been studying it for 40 plus years, obviously. I'm from the East Coast. I recently transplanted over here a year and a half or so ago, and I hear a lot of conflicting things. Is it actually getting worse? Ian aside, hurricanes aside, is the red tide like worsening year by year, or decade by decade?
So there's been some advancements in science that have allowed us to make those comparisons from past till present. The difficulty has been previously that the sampling was biased around events. So you get a lot of samples on the shoreline, on the beach, it's accessible. And it was during a time when people are coughing, fish are washing up. So it was only really in the last decade where we've been, and we being the state has a research entity in St. Pete, the Florida Wildlife Research Institute, that has implemented a strategic sampling and monitoring plan that's much more, not less biased, let's put it that way. And so after a decade of sort of that kind of data, you can look at it and you can see that the blooms are more intense, they're more widespread. Yeah, I mean, I would say we, the scientific community, is very concerned about, the impacts to the coast and to the, the everything, to wildlife and it's, once it gets started, it's like letting the genie out of the bottle. It's almost impossible to control. It just moves through ocean currents and it feeds off of nitrogen and phosphorus and sunlight.
And it's not a picky eater at all. It can make use of a lot of different, once it starts killing fish, it will consume them. It can consume itself. When the cells start to die, it can recycle its own nutrients. So it's not a picky eater at all. Will, there's like a million comments coming up here on the screen. Can you scroll through if there's anything that's relevant that hasn't been asked? We'll take a couple more questions. I'm sure there's a lot of people on there that have them too. Cody.
I got a quick question for you, Dr. Milbrand. Is there any information on the impact potentially of all the beach renourishment dredging that has taken place over the last few years? That, to the best of my knowledge, that phosphates, nitrates, and other heavy metals are in the sediment on the seafloor. There has been a lot of beach renourishment, especially after Hurricane that set off the red tide event of 2018. And I know that extends all the way up to Sarasota that they've done it. Has there been any information on that, whether that type of thing helps disturb it more? And I also noticed the same thing after the hurricane, all the dredging that was taking place on the causeway, that was quite extensive, and I noticed the spoil islands are a bit larger than before. So, is there any insight into that?
So the question was about beach renourishment and the links to red tide. So the contractors are required to do a certain amount of monitoring, testing while they do this work. So specifically related to renourishment, again, I don't think there's a link. However, theoretically, as you said, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus can get trapped in sediments for eons. I mean, just look at when you have oil deposits, it's a similar concept. So when you disturb them, either with wind events or through dredging, through sucking the sand up and putting it on the beach, potentially you could be mobilizing those. The interesting thing that we've been talking about, this particular dinoflagellate species, okay, it's a single-celled species. The life history of it contains a resting stage, and the resting stage has been undescribed by science. We think it's there, we think it lives in the sediments, but we don't know how to look for it, and we don't know where the pockets of it are. There are researchers that's their primary research topic, is to understand those life history connections, and at least other species of dinoflagellates have resting stages that have been described. So if you think there is a resting stage, or if you don't think there's a resting stage, there is a role of resuspending sediments and moving sediments from one place to another that could be possible.
Yes.
So just like you said, going back to the root cause of this influx of nutrients, is there research? I know SCC out does research in water, but is there research within your community on why those plants aren't uptaking the nutrients, because obviously nobody wants to dump excess fertilizer onto these crops. I've worked in agriculture for a couple of years, and that's one of the biggest expenses is dumping all this fertilizer. So only 30 to 40% of this fertilizer is actually getting taken up by the plants. Is there research being done on this? Because that seems like a solved issue for agriculture guys to not waste fertilizer and not spend money on it, and also not have this excess influx of nutrients.
Yeah, I wish I knew. The question was about how efficient plants are at taking up fertilizers, especially slow release fertilizers. And wouldn't it make sense to not over fertilize or overuse, because there's a cost issue associated with it. The problem is that like granular nitrogen is comparatively cheap. I mean, it's probably cheaper than water in some places. So there's not really an incentive to use less necessarily. There is a whole field of agricultural science that's based on maximizing efficiency of uptake into plant growth. I wish I knew that literature better. I think that the bigger issue is that a lot of land is draining into a common resource, and the water resource, and it's the downstream effect, unfortunately. So, it's hard to hold one person or one farmer accountable. They're all using best management practices in theory. They sign a piece of paper, says they're using them, but then there's no enforcement usually. There's an incentive for them to say and to sign a form that says they're using these best practices, but we don't really know if they're not, for example, letting the cows go right into the ditch that drains it in. It's a tributary to the Caloosahatchee. That's just one example. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't. I mean, the phosphorus, I know there's been some studies they've done up in the Kissimmee Basin where they've looked at land that hasn't, or at least they've been told, has not had any phosphorus added to it since like the 70s or the 80s. It's still exporting that phosphorus from 50 years ago, 40 years ago. So nitrogen is definitely flashier than that. You don't see it stay on the landscape that long, but like Eric said, I mean, nitrogen and phosphorus are both super, super cheap. And I don't know what the price per pound is for nitrogen. I know it's even higher than phosphorus, but it costs about $300 a pound to remove that phosphorus once it gets into the waterways. But again, those fertilizers are so cheap to put down that, and nitrogen is even harder for it to be efficient just because it is water soluble. I mean, a little bit of rain on nitrogen fertilizer and it's all over the place, and the root systems of the plants are only so efficient. But yeah, again, there's the economic incentive there is clearly not enough. It's when you're dealing with a product that's that cheap to apply, the market's not going to correct that problem, and that's what we're clearly seeing the result of. Yes.
Is there any potential to combat red tide with bacteria like bacillus or anything like that?
So the question is about red tide and bacteria. So what's really interesting is that viruses affect marine phytoplankton. Their relationships in the laboratory in some cases are pretty well understood. Not really for this particular dinoflagellate, but for other dinoflagellates, you can introduce a virus that will attack and lyse the cell. In some ways that could be really great, but in the scale of a bloom that we have right now, there's no treatment. I mean, we're talking Tampa Bay to Key West. So although there are fewer side effects, you would still lyse the cell, the toxins would still be solubilized, and you'd still have impacts to fish. But it's anything that we can do more research on, we need to. And I think those virus cell interactions are incredibly understudied. And there's probably like a dozen people in the world that are studying that.
Will, can we take a couple questions from online? We'll do one more here in the back.
Yeah, Harold's got one right here.
So while we wait for the reservoir to be built, is there opportunities to utilize existing infrastructure to send more water south? And what is the reservoir design with in phases or pools where it can be utilized during construction?
Great question, Harold. So the question was, until the reservoir is built, is there an interim solution, and can pieces of the reservoir be utilized before it's fully built? And yes to both. So the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, or LOSOM, is something we're like right up to the finish line on, and to get the full benefit out of that, it's going to take a full water year from the time it's implemented until the time we start to see those benefits. But it was supposed to be implemented next month, but the Army Corps is just, it takes them a little bit longer on some things, so the goalpost got moved back a little bit. I believe there's actually going to be a stakeholder meeting next week that kind of gives an update on where we're at with that. That will give the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers about a 37% annual reduction in the harmful discharges, which is a huge benefit to us and the East Coast, and an even bigger benefit to the Everglades that's getting all that clean water that they depend on. The other piece of that question was what happens during the construction of this EAA reservoir. What happened is the state came out and said, hey, we want to start building the STA components. There's two pieces to this reservoir. It has a storage function, which is the deep water piece, and then it has the wetland component, which is the filter to clean the water before it flows south. And that water is, that wetland is just marsh grasses that are strategically planted for optimal nutrient sequestration. And that state's portion, the 6,500 acre STA, will be complete by the end of this year. So we'll start to get some incremental benefit out of that STA. And that's a big challenge in Everglades restoration right now, is those 60,000 acres that are down there now are predominantly used to deal with runoff in the EAA. The farm fields down there, which about 95% of them annually are sugarcane, they don't store and treat their own water. They utilize state-owned infrastructure, the STAs, to do that. So this wetland that's part of this EAA reservoir project will allow Lake Okeechobee water to come down and be filtered in there before going into that reservoir. So it's looking like 2030 for the deep water reservoir, but you get the benefit of that STA by the end of this year. So hopefully going into next rainy season, it'll be utilized. LOSOM is really the big thing, and that's the Everglades restoration. There's three pieces to it. You have the nutrient pollution reductions, you have operations, which is how you're managing all the infrastructure you have, and then you have the infrastructure, which is building a more resilient system. So it comes down to all of those, but the nutrient pollution is the one that is the longest to see the timeline to recovery on it. The operations of what we have now, plus building more infrastructure to deal with more extreme weather events, and even just to deal with what we're dealing with right now. We're losing the battle. We're having to discharge all this water. The Everglades isn't getting what it needs. So you build that infrastructure, you have more resilience there. And as each project comes online, it's all about operating it to the benefit of the estuaries and more balanced, rather than what we've been doing for the last couple decades.
We're gonna take a couple more questions and then we're gonna roll into the film.
Okay.
Just to be mindful of everyone's time. I know Jason had one over here.
When we talk about the red tide equation, there's a lot of talk of agriculture, runoff, and storms. But I don't hear much about the phosphate industry. Is the phosphate industry in Western Florida not a big part of this?
So, yeah, we focus less on the phosphate in the Caloosahatchee because the mining is occurring, in the Peace River Basin and Myakka, which are both huge contributors to the coastal ocean. So, yeah, they're mobilizing phosphorus at rates that are not, much higher than historically. So, those activities, obviously, they're regulated. They're supposed to not have spills happen, which have happened. They're supposed to monitor their water quality, and but even so, I think it's hard to point the finger at one industry when you have natural phosphate deposits that create higher phosphorus conditions in the Boca Grande area and coming from a piece of Mayaca River. Certainly, the existing rules and regulations should be enforced. The same would be, I could say, for agriculture and for suburban. At least in suburban, we have requirements for stormwater storage and treatment. One of the biggest problems in the Everglades and why we're doing all these projects is we don't have enough storage and treatment. So it's kind of a common theme.
This is for Daniel. You mentioned a couple pieces of legislation that are currently being discussed during this legislative session. Do they have sponsors? What should we be looking for to come out of this session? That's the first part. And then the second part of it, is there anything that you're monitoring closely that we should be looking at? I guess we're defending. I don't know if that includes HB 1197 or it's a Senate bill. That's something that we should be following. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So the best thing you do is take out your phone right now and scan that QR code and get put onto our action alerts. If you go to sccf.org, and I'm sure Cody from Calusa Waterkeeper, you all be monitoring all that as well. So Calusa Waterkeeper, this QR code, and sccf.org. Go there, sign up for all the action alerts. 1197, it doesn't look good. Basically, what that bill does is it strips away protections for local governments to protect wetlands, and it puts all the power in Tallahassee, and they're in legislative session for 60 days, so it's plenty of time to make all the decisions throughout the whole state, right? So that's what they think, let's consolidate all the power up here. We're looking to see kind of what everything that's filed, the good stuff, the bad stuff. We will be communicating through this. SCCF will be doing the same. I'm sure Calusa Waterkeeper will be doing the same as well. If any of us put out a action alert on anything, follow it and share it with all your friends. There are probably going to be some times that captains and SCCF and Calusa Waterkeeper may be focused on different issues. We have, when you're dealing with water policy, you have only so much political capital that you can drive into a couple things. And, if there's one of our organizations that's not pushing something out, the other that is, it's probably a very good thing for you to get involved with that. Like I said, the good legislation, we have not started pushing that. I don't know how much that's been filed yet, but within the next 2 to 3 weeks, you'll be getting some alerts from us on that. And the level of concern that we usually put on something is pretty indicative of how much of a threat or how good it is. If it's something that's as threatening as Senate Bill 2508, I promise you, you will hear about it. Your phone will be blowing up. They'll find ways to get you wherever, get that information to you. So sign up for those action alerts. And if you see something, come take action on that.
It's a good intro for the film. Ready?
Yeah. So we're gonna put this Senate Bill 2508 film up next. It's about a half hour. Again, yeah. If anybody needs to grab a drink, run out there and do that. This bill was filed just over a year ago. A lot of people in this room. Gene is our board chair now. Henley was up there. Bob Brooks was up there. Several others in here as well. Came up to Tallahassee. Ozzie Lessender, I don't know where he went. There he is. Josh. A lot of people helped ultimately kill this, but this is a really good